So the mystical path, what is that? Mysticism, I think that the easiest way to understand it is it's an appreciation and experience of the inner life. It's not about the stuff we can detect through our senses. It's about the stuff that we can't, but that we experience nonetheless. Sometimes our senses are involved, but they're usually secondary in the process. When we go within and we contemplate or we meditate, we are in that mystical realm. It is a space that is, actually it isn't a space, it's free of space and free of time. It is getting in touch with the ultimate reality, which is beyond the physical but contains it. A lot of the mystical writings over the ages, they don't make a lot of sense from a linear kind of a perspective. Matter of fact, if they did make sense from a linear perspective, they wouldn't be mystical writings. In the Science of Mind textbook, Dr. Holmes weaves a mystical approach with another element. There's really two elements of our teaching. I've mentioned these before. The first element that many of us come here and really connect with and identify is what I would call working with the law. It's learning how to, the change your thinking, change your life approach. Learning to have a different experience of the physical realm, of your own life experience. And that's really important, I think. That's really important that we have the capacity to live a life that is joyful and prosperous and all the other things that we would desire. But woven in with that is the mystical approach, what I would call courting the beloved, which is becoming familiar with our own God nature by means of our inner selves. You've probably heard, I know many of you have had, what we would call a mystical experience, which is usually an experience of going outside of your body in some way or so deep within your body that you're not aware of your body and becoming, it's usually described as a sense of becoming one with everything. There's a wonderful book called The History of Mysticism that's about 35 different mystics throughout the ages, and what they all share in common is having these experiences and having two great frustrations. The first frustration is that they can't describe the experience. Words are inadequate. And the second frustration is it's really hard to get that experience back. The mystical experience can be cultivated. Matter of fact, in the East, most of the traditions that we call yogic traditions are about cultivating the mystical nature of who we are. But that's years and years of practice. And then sometimes these mystical experiences just show up to the completely uninitiated. Many of us had them as children, where all of a sudden you're kind of aware that there's more than just you, or more than this planet, or more than whatever. And there's different kinds of mystical experiences. There's nature mystical experiences and cosmic and so forth. And that's not our purpose to talk about them today. Dr. Holmes said, when the scientists finally reach the mountaintop of understanding, they will find the mystics waiting for them. That quite often, in fact, this is playing out. What science discovers over time is what the mystics have been talking about for thousands of years, in terms of the nature of reality, in terms of how things work at a macro level. The idea that, for example, what we consider to be a solid object really isn't. It's just from our perspective and our sensory understanding of that this podium is solid. If you were the size of an electron, which is very small, you could go right through this podium and it would be like empty space, because the relationship of the electron to the nucleus of the atom is about similar in size on scale to the distance between the planets in our solar system. And then to add another level of complexity, they're not just being there going around in orbits, they're popping in and out at different places at different times. The quantum nature of things. We think of time as a linear thing, although we've all experienced time speeding up and slowing down, right? tends to speed up when you're really engaged in something. It tends to slow down when you're in traffic or waiting in the doctor's office. I was just reading a great quote today. It said, "Time is not linear. It's like a quantum foam. It behaves like cream when poured into a hot cup of coffee." One of the things that Einstein discovered was that space and time are curved in the physical universe due to gravity and other forces. So what all this says is that there's more to reality than our senses and our understanding to this point as humanity can really reveal. There's a lot more going on. Our essential nature, you might say from a spiritual perspective, is that this body is just really a secondary aspect of who we are. In fact, it limits our capacity to fully express who we are. But it's a convenient vehicle for being on earth at this point in time. Colin Wilson, who I love, is a great author. He said, "Religion, mysticism, and magic all spring from the same basic feeling about the universe. A sudden feeling of meaning which human beings sometimes pick up accidentally, as your radio might pick up some unknown station. Poets feel that we are cut off from meaning by a thick lead wall, and that sometimes, for no reason, we can understand that the wall seems to vanish, or for no reason we can understand, the wall seems to vanish, and we are suddenly overwhelmed with a sense of the infinite interestingness of things." There's a famous incident in Dr. Holmes' life when he had a mystical experience at the Whittier Church in California, where he was speaking. He said, he just kind of got woo-woo for a minute. And he said, "The veil is very thin." He was talking about the veil between what we perceive as reality and the greater reality behind it. The mystical elements are very important if you're on a spiritual path, because that's where you're headed. We're sort of like on a way station in this human experience that we have. It's like being at a train station. And the real purpose of being at a train station is what? To get on the train and go somewhere, right? But if you think about it, we're kind of at the train station thinking this is all there is the train station. And when people intimate to us, the great spiritual teachers intimate, "Oh no, there's much more. You're going to get on that train and it's going to go into infinity." We say, "Oh, you're crazy. I can't even see a train." Well, you got off the train here. How do you think you got to the station? And you're going to get back on it and go whatever or wherever is next. And we kind of end up in this place of wanting to understand it all from the perspective of the train station. Wayne Dyer's talk about the thing of two twins in utero, talking about having a conversation, and one says to the other, "Do you think there's life after birth?" The other one says, "No, I don't think so. I think this is it." The other says, "Do you believe in mom?" "No, I don't believe in mom. I've never seen her." See? Our limited perspective kind of keeps us sort of locked in. So, we often ask the question, is there life after death? I think a better question is there life before death? Are we living fully in this life experience? And living fully means, I think, moving more and more toward a mystical understanding by doing practices that help to enable that. There's value in it. Joseph Campbell says, "There is an essential experience of any mystical realization. You die to your flesh and are born to your spirit. You identify yourself with the consciousness and life of which your body is but the vehicle. You die to the vehicle and become identified in your consciousness with that of which the vehicle is but the carrier. That is the God. We get so grounded in the physical world, in the day-to-day happenings, in the way our mind processes information and anticipates the future and thinks about the past, that often we lose track or lose the capacity, even in some cases, to entertain a deeper realm that none of this matters in. I put a thing on Facebook the day after the midterm elections. I put 3 places in the universe where the results of the elections have no being, or don't matter, and it was 3 galaxies that were not the Milky Way. And it was amazing how many people responded, "Oh, thank you for the perspective." We get so wrapped up in the import of these kinds of things. And it's not that that's not going to affect your physical life and maybe your emotional life, but only to the degree that you let it. I have managed to survive this long under governments of both political parties. And yet you hear every election, this is the end. Right? Where does that come from? That apocalyptic notion that if everyone doesn't think the way I think, we're all doomed. Well, it's part of our growing up process as a species. Maybe when we get to the point where we don't think that way anymore, we'll simply dissolve into the nothingness and we'll be on the train. That's what the Buddha nature is. The Buddha is the one who has moved through all the levels of development and realized the fullness of truth, and the Buddha disappears, leaves form. Originally in Buddhism, there were no statues or depictions of the Buddha. Because when you become a Buddha, you're no longer in form by definition. But then Buddhism began to expand, and they wanted to appeal to the masses, and the masses need something tangible to look at. They need some kind of a sensory experience of the teacher, or the Buddhists don't believe in a God, but they needed something they could see and touch and feel. So now you have Buddha statues. You may have some in your backyard. I wonder if they have Jesus on the cross in their yards in India. If you go to the New Delhi Target, in the garden section are there little, These are the things I think about. Gerald May said, God is closer to us, the mystics say, than our breath. Closer than we are to ourselves. St. John of the Cross says, we are in God like a stone is in the earth, already in the center. There is no way to get any closer to God than we already are. The spiritual life, then, is not about actually coming closer to God, but rather the realization of the communion and union that already exists and always has and always will forever. See, often people will ask, is the science of mind a Christian teaching? And the answer to that is, it depends on your view of Christianity. Because one thing we are not is what would be termed a redemptionist teaching, that you need to be redeemed or saved in order to go forward in spiritual growth or awareness or to the next stop. We would say, no, you need to simply realize what is already so. To realize what is already so. There is nothing to fix. You're not going to get any more spiritual than you already are, because you're 100% spiritual. there may be some room for growth in your realization of that. But see, it's not about creating a greater truth, it's about realizing a truth that already exists. That's hard for us because, A, our senses tend to tell us something different, or at least the way we've been conditioned to use our senses does. And B, the culture that surrounds us are people that also have that experience of being conditioned to believe this is all there is, that this is it. Or they believe in some kind of a deity or some kind of a realm that is magical, that can only be reached kind of metaphorically or so forth. If here and now is eternal, then here and now must be enough. Kind of interesting. See, the mystical stuff, it's kind of like getting into quantum physics, you know. If you understand it, you don't understand it. I want to share this piece. It was a little long to put on the screen. Evelyn Underhill was a mystic, a new thought, kind of involved in new thought over the years, and wrote this little piece I wanted to share. When these full-grown, vital mystics try to tell us about the life they have achieved, it's always an intensively active life that they describe. They say that they go up and down the ladder of contemplation. They stretch up toward the point, the unique reality to which all the intricate and many-colored lines of life flow, and in which they are merged, and rush out toward those various lives in a passion of active love and service. This double activity, this swinging between rest and work, this alone, they say, is truly the life of man. Because this alone represents, on human levels, something of that inexhaustibly rich yet simple life, ever active and ever at rest, which they find in God. Therefore, contemplation, even at its highest, dearest, and most intimate, is not to be for you an end in itself. It shall only be yours when it impels you to action, when the double movement of the transcendent love, drawing inwards to unity and fruition, and rushing out again to creative acts, is realized in you. You are to be a living, ardent tool with which the supreme artist works. One of the instruments of his self-manifestation, the perpetual process by which his reality is brought into concrete expression. The modern understanding of enlightenment is not an inner sense that is contained within the individual. It is that inner realization that is then taken out into the world. The concept of the bodhisattva within the Buddhist tradition is one way of looking at that. The bodhisattva is someone who is just on the brink of Buddhahood, who is eligible to enter nirvana, which means to leave form, but who out of their great compassion for those that are still working their way toward that, they turn away from nirvana, they turn back to humanity, and they serve and teach. Many Buddhists believe that Jesus was a bodhisattva, that Muhammad was a bodhisattva, that Rumi was a bodhisattva. People that were eligible to move on beyond this realm, but out of that great compassion they stayed and taught. Another way that enlightenment is being looked at today by Ken Wilber and others is that it is that inner realization that is then turned to something of service in the world. It might be spiritual activism, it might be teaching, loving, serving, helping in some way. That is the evidence of enlightenment. In a more modern context, this reading by Natasha Dern, I think, speaks to it. So what is enlightenment? How about coming down from that mountain and putting your unity consciousness to the test amidst mortgage payments and credit card debt, divorce lawyers and aging parents, nasty bosses and health problems, war and poverty? Such conditions, as the alchemist knows, burn away the dross to reveal who we are not. Yes, in the midst of the madness, we awaken, grow comfortable with our dualistic nature, and develop mystical stamina so that we can handle our sobriety. Illusions are like drugs, and enlightenment is like rehab. The Dalai Lama said, when one looks at the world and all of the chaos and uncertainty, one might well break out in laughter. Because at the mystical level, none of that matters. It matters in the immediate experience of people that may be suffering, but it's all an illusion to the essence of who you are. This is the thing that we have so much trouble accepting, especially in the West. You say, if I was giving this talk in India, they'd be going, yeah, right, tell me something I don't know. Which I'm sure some of you are doing too. Especially Andy. But we are so conditioned to be results-oriented, to be self-judgmental and judgmental of others. Are we measuring up in whatever way we think that should happen? Usually we go by something like the Protestant work ethic, one of the worst maladies ever inflicted upon a culture. The early Christians in the first 100 years disdained possessions. If anyone in the group was hungry, everyone helped that person to eat, or the entire community fasted until there was enough food. Jesus clearly was not seeking possessions. He had that one really cool seamless robe that some of his rich patrons made for him. But he wasn't, operating out of a nice condo in Jerusalem. He wasn't cruising the countryside in a chariot with the finest stallions leading it. He wasn't trying to get into the gossip columns and have his name mentioned. He wasn't seeking a corner office. He wasn't measuring himself against how the other prophets were doing.
How many Twitter followers do you have?
Good question. Okay, let's get one thing straight. I work alone. Except on Q&A Sunday. Okay. Which we're overdue for, in fact. Anyway, yeah, we don't know. We know that wasn't a big priority. When did it become a big priority? Look at our Christian nation and where we put our energy. That if you're poor, there's something wrong with you. And you just want what I have. So the hell with you. We do that in our national policy. We do it in our local policy. We do it in our schools. We do it in our homes. Why? Because we're so engaged with the surface, with the stuff. We're killing the planet to get the stuff. We're fouling our nest. And we're about the only creature that really does that. What is enlightenment? What are the priorities in my life? The priorities in my life are what I'm putting my attention to, what I'm putting my energy into. That's my priorities. The mystic says It doesn't matter. Joseph Campbell says, the goal of the community is to kill the mystic, which is the mystic's goal, to die to the material world. The Sufis, which is the mystical tradition of Islam, one of the mystical traditions of Islam, the whirling dervishes and all that. Rumi was a Sufi poet. The Sufis have one desire: to merge. Not on the freeway. To merge with the one, to disappear to this physical nature and to become one with the beloved. In fact, to disdain what many of us seek in our lives, which doesn't make what we're doing wrong. The enlightened position, I think, is to be constantly living in the question of, what am I doing? Where am I putting my attention? What am I valuing? What am I devaluing or disowning? And is the result of all this this energy and intention, is it bringing me to a better place in life, to a place that I feel joyful and happy, and do I feel like a contributor? Do I feel like I'm being my best self? Would I be proud to stand in front of a large crowd of strangers and friends and relatives and tell them what's really on my mind most of the time? When we focus on the outer world exclusively, it's like living in a mud puddle. It's not very deep. In the depths is where reality lies. It's where the truth lies. It's where our true potential lies. The idea is to really dive deep into life, not out here, but to dive deep within. And you can tell, I think, you're getting enlightened when the world creates within you a greater sense of sadness combined with a greater desire to laugh. Isn't it sad that so many people are suffering needlessly? And isn't it nice to know that ultimately it won't matter? Because anything that happens in this lifetime, in this corporeal body, disappears when we get to our essence. Just like when you cut your hand and it's a tragedy, and a week later you can't even see where the cut was. We are all destined to be healed. Our choice is, are we going to do it during this lifetime or wait for another experience? And that's the choice we live in. Thank you, and namaste.